To all the participants of Riga StratCom Dialogue 2021, and we start our registered part of the discussion. And we start with a case study, a very recent case study, and I think that is one of the ways how we as StratCom practitioners, as people dealing with foreign interference and countering foreign interference, we are learning from each other. And that's one of the aims of this conference, is to learn from each other. And we are very pleased that we have Jan Havranek, Deputy Defense Minister from the Czech Republic, joining us to discuss the very recent case that Madame Jourova already alluded to, and that is the discovery by the investigators of the actions by the Russian people on the Czech soil. And I remember myself, back in 17th of April, I read a quite shocking tweet saying that Czech Republic has expelled 18 Russian diplomats, which in itself is probably not that shocking, but the shocking was the reason behind it, that they found out that back in 2014, the two Russian citizens have been involved in a bombing or explosion in the site in Czech Republic that resulted in the deaths of two Czech citizens. And of course, the rest is, I think, well known to the community, but we are here today to go through what happened, what are the lessons learned, what we can learn from this case, and what should be the mechanisms that we have to remember when the situations like that happen. So, Jan, welcome to Riga StratCom Dialogue. We're very pleased to see you here, to join us. And of course, I'll first start with a simple question. Tell us what happened.
Hello, and good morning from Brussels and good afternoon to Riga. I'm joining you on the margins of the Foreign Affairs Council in the defense format that's taking place here today in Brussels. At which the Czech Republic will be presenting or updating the member states of the European Union on the situation. And I'm happy to talk about the general description of what has happened, Jānis, in just a few words. But I should also note that the whole incident, albeit it happened in 2014, is still a subject of investigation, and therefore information is still rather limited. But as you have all seen and read, in mid-April, the Czech government announced that in 2014, there was a severe act of Russian aggression taking place on the Czech territory, which resulted into the explosion of two depot ammunition storage sites and death to Czech citizens. And there is all evidence pointing to the two agents from GRU being the perpetrators of this incident, and these two agents being the well-known Salisbury group, Anatoly Chepiga and Alexander Mishkin. Now, what followed afterwards was a diplomatic row between the Czech Republic and Russia that has been settled by expelling of a substantive number of Russian diplomats and staff from the Czech embassy, and eventually the Russian embassy in Prague, and vice versa. Finally, the two countries setting on a fixed number at both embassy, but we have managed to substantially downsize the Russian diplomatic presence and intelligence presence in our country. Now, of course, as you have said, this has been a great case study of how a conflict in the information environment can look like, even with a great retrospect. And I'm happy to talk about it throughout the discussion today.
Actually, let's go right into that information space piece. So, were you surprised after your initial announcement of the Russian information space response? Because I think there have been quite a few cases, like you mentioned yourself, and some of the subjects are of the same Skripal case. There were already the cases where Russia did certain sets of responses in information space. Were you planning for it? Were you surprised?
I personally was surprised by the speed of action in the information space, which suggests that this has been in planning and that there was no coincidence in the actions in the info space that took place. Just to describe, to the audience, there are a number of websites, Russian-sponsored websites in the Czech Republic that are well monitored, and that for the past year or so have been investing their resources and time into spreading false news and disinformation about COVID-19 pandemic. Now that stopped almost abruptly with the announcement of that incident by the Czech government, and overnight, within hours, they switched to pro-Kremlin narratives, working almost according to the traditional disinformation guidebook we have seen in other situations. So the main narratives used almost immediately in a very elaborate way were denying, for instance, that the events happened the way the government presented them, questioning the credibility of government sources and the intelligence services of the Czech Republic, my country being labeled a puppet of the West, puppet of NATO, puppet of the United States, simplifying and discounting the incident, even with crazy ideas such as the weapons destroyed were intended for Islamic radicals and or that they were just a pretext to justify an aggression against Russia. And if I can still continue, I mean, these narratives have been numerous, including the saying that there has been no evidence of Russian involvement. All of this has been made up. There's a cover-up pretext for a coup in Belarus, and you name it. So that was quite fascinating. The speed of the reaction by these disinformation websites we've seen.
It's very interesting that you point to the fact that it was very fast, which I think kind of shows that there was possibility for some pre-planning, or we should point that the response time for Russia is very, very quick. The other thing is obviously the use of the already existing infrastructure, probably before that working on different less vivid narratives, but clearly being used when necessary. I think that's also something that everybody has to take away. And lastly, I think your point about different kind of narratives being put about discrediting the story, that looks very much like both Salisbury as well as Downing MH17 aircraft by distorting as much as possible the playing field. So it's basically from a playbook. But let me, Jan, ask you, when the government was starting to kind of put out these information about their actions and deciding on their action, was there a StratCom strategy behind that? Understanding that you'll have to push back and there'll be response, and what was there a strategy? And what were the main elements within that strategy, if there was?
I would say, it's been a great lesson learned on StratCom for us. And it really underlined the fact that we need a much more robust and coordinated StratCom on the level of the Czech government, coordinated on the intra-ministerial level, but hopefully and possibly by the Office of the Prime Minister themselves. Now, that is not to say that we have not had any StratCom whatsoever, but it was less coordinated, or it's been less coordinated than it should be. And very quickly, unfortunately, the incident also turned into a domestic political turmoil that is still ongoing. So now it's difficult to distinguish who's sharing what narrative, etc. But going back really to the concept of Stratcom, we could have done better. But there have been, just to illustrate, give you one example to illustrate specifically what my ministry, the Ministry of Defense, dealt with. One of the allegations was that the weapons stored in those depots were illegal weapons, and that was widely spread by Sputnik, both nationally and internationally. So the Ministry of Defense, in coordination with MFA, Ministry of Interior, and others, we put out a statement debunking, this as fake news. And Sputnik, as a serious media, of course, accepted that statement, and they incorporated it in their article. But it was really buried as a paragraph number 5, and the original subtitle or the headline that was misleading, and that was actually framing that false narrative that illegal weapons were stored in the Czech Republic, that still continued to spread across social networks and websites. So it was a typical case that even if you react promptly and in a coordinated way, you can't still really, get away from that false narrative entirely. But at least I felt that this was a great and successful cooperation that happened within minutes, in fact, across the ministry. So it showed that the Stratcom on an intergovernmental level is possible, but you need to have it well and better organized.
Well, thank you for those points. That has been something that we've been always saying to people, that if you want to have a good Stratcom, you have to have a whole government approach. Otherwise, it is just niches of some capability that would not deal with a national crisis. But of course, I will also note that many of the Baltic states would probably not share your point of view of Sputnik being a serious media, but that's of course a local perspective on things.
It was quote unquote, of course.
Yeah, okay, let's make it clear. Okay, so then let's move to the next element, and that is what I think has been always the question mark. When there are, against the news that you bring, there are multiple conspiracy theories, what really happened, pushed. There's a big question mark. How many of those we're trying to debunk? Is it every single one of those? Or what was your strategy in that? Or is still?
Again, it's difficult, and I don't necessarily want to reveal all of the details, but the lesson we are learning, and we have learned in the past, is that you really have to target the source of disinformation rather than just trying to debunk every single retweet and repost. You really have to cut it off, ideally at the source. It's almost like a cancer, unfortunately. You really have to treat the origin in order to be successful. And so in that respect, we need to start looking at the establishment of these sources. I'm not talking about censorship, but we need to make sure that all the rules are followed, that all the taxes are paid, for instance, and it's really run for the long term. I mean, we can recognize that this is now happening as this incident is still transpiring, but we need to look at those websites in the longer term. But of course, all of that needs to be done while preserving the freedom of speech and abiding by the law. So, I would say, ask me in about a month's time, maybe in 6 months. But we're certainly, as this whole situation is still evolving, we're taking good note, because after all, one of the tasks of my ministry is to propose a systematic approach to strategic communication and how it should be conducted on the interministerial level. This is one of the tasks that was issued to the ministry a couple of years ago, and it has not been fully implemented. And that task has been once again stated in a recent document that my government adopted, National Strategy to Counter Foreign and Hybrid Interference. And Stratcom appears there quite clearly, and we are learning the lesson.
Well, Jan, I'm evidently biased on that, but I would argue that not having a good StratCom capability at one point or other is getting back at the given government, because the crises come, and irrespective of the type of crisis, is it pandemic, is it within other nation, it always is about strategic communications capability, very important in my view. So let's move to the Czech people. You've said Russians had a set of sites and newsletters that would be emitting information on pandemics, probably other things. So that means there was some audience that would be listening to them beforehand, and then they switched. What is your assessment? How were they able to really get to the Czech audience with their messaging? Were they successful? And what were your response mechanisms?
They have been successful in reaching their audience because, frankly speaking, the audience that consumes any kind of fake news or conspiracy theories is prone to Russian propaganda. Let's put it this way, and quite clearly. So again, I'm not, I don't want to talk in detail about individual steps we're taking, but there have been, for instance, on the MOD website, dozens of people working on the social networks to try to set the narratives correct and set them right. But of course, it's an extremely demanding work, and as I said before, you can't counter every single narrative. I should also mention that in about a week into that Vrbetica incident, there was another news that pointed out to Czech citizens being involved in supporting terrorism, international terrorism and terrorist activities in Ukraine. Our law enforcement officers, they arrested a number of people in suspicion and in link with supporting the troops, Russian-sponsored troops in Donbass. But of course, as you look at some of these people who, by the way, went public on the websites, you find them being the discussants and often contributing at the fora and the websites that are spreading this information. So there clearly is a link and a successful strategy by these platforms to reach out to specific and concrete individuals who become then the ambassadors of this information. But once again, there are legal instruments that can address that type of behavior as well.
Well, you're right, and most of the time, at least from our research perspective, we see it's always a long-term strategy behind it. It's not something that has been just done in 1 or 2 days. That's been a persistent strategy over the years, and I guess we need to have the same persistent strategy that can enable us at the time of a crisis. But if we don't, it's very difficult. Well, there's one layer where this conflict plays out in between the two countries. The other layer is the Czech audience, but the third layer is international. And clearly, I think in many of the cases, what is probably the most detrimental is how international community reacts to it and what's the support you get from that. What is your assessment? Were you successful in getting that international support, at least from NATO and EU? You said yourself you're right now in the process of doing something already, but what's your assessment? Did this work out for you?
I think the initial reaction has been very strong and showed a clear support by NATO allies and members of the European Union and international community in general. We're very grateful for the fact that the EU and NATO both have managed to agree on statements condemning Russia's behavior in such a short time. Some people said and suggested, why it took so long, but I still think it was a success within the short time. And then a number of other countries and friends have responded through diplomatic reciprocal measures vis-a-vis Russia. And that, of course, shows clear solidarity. So for me, the debate is not measuring the number of Russian diplomats expelled right now and after the Skripal poisoning, but it's really to show the speed of reaction and the fact that we are still talking about this today. Just coming from stepping out of the defense ministerial meeting, I can just testify that all of the ministers my boss has met with this morning, the first item on their mind was the Verbetice case and showing how unacceptable Russia's behavior and strategy it is. So it might not be seen visibly among the agenda, among the strategic compass and capability development cooperation, but the fact that we have a special any other business a couple of weeks after any other business item, a couple of weeks after the announcement of the incident shows a great interest and support by the international community. And I want to thank to all of you watching from your capitals for that support. It's still needed. The case is not done. And we are consulting individually and of course at NATO and the EU as well about additional next steps. So a big thank you from Prague via Brussels today.
From Prague via Brussels. Interesting concept. Actually, one of the other things that I wanted to inquire when we think about this international reaction, there are a number of different mechanisms, EU rapid reaction mechanism, G7 is talking or having one as well and talking about using that for coordination of responses, including into the kind of StratCom realm. What was your assessment? How useful were they? Did you use them at all?
If I can be frank, I think we need to review the mechanisms by the European Union and NATO. And by the way, I think your Center of Excellence plays a vital role in reviewing and assessing that. As my country is at the center of this, we're quite busy, but you're in the position where you have been following the StratCom trends for a number of years. You have your own analyses, and I want to thank you in front of the international audience here also for your advice and support throughout the initial phases. And I promise this has not been prescripted, but I really want to underline the importance of reviewing those mechanisms and learning the lessons that we need to incorporate and look at all the tools available that each organization, international organization, and nationally countries have at their disposal, and really do a laundry list, if you will, and look at what can be done. But of course, in order to employ those tools, you need to understand, you need to have a thorough understanding of what has happened, going back to your initial question of the impact. So I'm hoping to see a more detailed analysis, if not by you, then maybe by some other entities or think tanks of the information environment, its assessment, so that we can really get the bigger picture of how large the disinformation impact of this incident has been. And then we should discuss at the various platforms what instruments can we improve, what can we do better, etc. But of course, our request at the Foreign Affairs Council, at the EU earlier, well, last month, and also at the North Atlantic Council was, please employ your national and institutional StratCom systems in order to make sure that we do coordinate and we use what's at our disposal. The question is, how effective this has been. I think it's still relatively soon to evaluate, but we should certainly undertake that assessment.
You bring up a very interesting point, and if I can kind of unpack it a little bit, is that you didn't find quite the existing mechanisms very much fit for purpose, at least in the early stages, and I'm probably putting it a bit too far, but I think one thing that we have to take away from all of this as a community is that once these things happen, we have to look back at whether the mechanisms we created have they been fit for purpose, and what are the things that we have to really go back and update or fix or change. Because I think in looking at your particular case, the first few days are the most essential ones, and then of course it starts to go its own course. But I think especially in these days, first days, one has to rely on mechanisms whereby you bring the support, and there's a more coordination available. And of course we'll try to do something about looking at this, because I think it's important. It's really important case study. If I may now look at a bit wider perspective as a lesson learned from your case, and this is a question from the audience. How do we deter an adversary that shrugs off attribution, focuses on its own StratCom, and dismisses condemnations as evidence that their narrative is true? Which is, I think, is quite a pointed question, huh?
It's a fitting question to any type of scenario that requires prompt action and also strong StratCom. My simple answer is by showing that we are strong. And you can do that, of course, in multiple ways. You can do it through acts of solidarity, through diplomatic channels, through measured and targeted action, through signaling and military posturing. I mean, these are all the good examples and toolbox we already have available at our disposal. But what you need to do in order to increase the trust in your, trust of your citizens and trust in your institutions, I think that's really key to underline here, is to employ those tools relatively fast. So it's not only about strategic communications, which to me, after all, is a tool of deterrence, continuous and long-term deterrence, or approach to deterrence, but you need to know what you need to do, and for that you need better coordination, which starts with the functioning mechanism on the domestic level, with tabletop exercises and discussions, so that you are at least back in your mind, you have this pre-played and pre-stored mindset for such a situation, and then you need to exercise all of that. So it is a full spectrum. I mean, we're not reinventing the wheel. I think all of the key tools have been described and well known, but sometimes it takes incidents and attacks like these that really enable you to speed up the work on strategic communications or your overall deterrence. And again, the purpose is not to shut down each and every website that spreads out false news and disinformation. It's really about winning hearts and minds. And in our democratic societies, we do that by showing how capable these institutions are that are well functioning. And if we can do it on an international level, even better.
From our experience, tabletopping these kind of situations, hybrid or StratCom perspectives of that is really, really good way forward, as much as you can involve both the government and elements of the society. But then on the deterrence, there is of course an edge to that question, and that is that how much can you deter only by saying, well, I'll be strong in my defense? Is there a forward-leaning deterrence necessary? What are your thoughts on that?
What do you mean by forward-leaning?
Well,
but of course, I mean, deterrence is not only passive. I mean, you have to, even by exercising, you show activity and you signal your intent. And that can be done also through active engagement. And I'm not talking necessarily about a military engagement, but you need to be working in the information space, in the info environment, which is, by the way, what we're doing here today throughout the StratCom Summit. And so yes, you know, our deterrence should not be only passive, but you know, our posture, I believe, should always be defensive. But you can also prepare for a strong defense through active engagement.
Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you for giving half an hour of your time. We know you're very busy and many things have to be done back in Brussels. But I'll just note that it is so important when these things happen, not only support the nations in our StratCom efforts, but also take stock and evaluate. And thank you, Jan, for being with us and helping us to do a kind of look back a little bit and make our lessons learned and think about what we can take away from your experience and what can, from your experience, make us all together better. Thank you. And with
well,
that,
I want to thank you as well. Thanks for this opportunity and thanks for your support and solidarity.
Thank you. And with that, we are moving on to our first panel proper. And that would be on, surprise, surprise, global pandemic turned infodemic, tackling the threat to national security. I think a very, very topical issue that's been on most of our minds for a year or so, and has given many new perspectives in the way information environment looks like, in the way information flows, in the way it affects the society, and in the way society reacts. With that, Elena, over to you.